Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. This episode of History of Jackson was sponsored by the Bean Around Coffee. Bean Around Coffee is based in Peterborough and they sell and make some amazing coffee. You can head to their website to buy some coffee beans or some coffee grounds. Now they make some fantastic coffee and it is my favourite coffee in the country. And for you want to grab yourself some coffee, head to www.thebeanaround.com and use the discount code HWJ and the Bear 10 for 10% off all your purchases. I'll leave the discount code and the website in the description below. Hi guys, welcome to the History of Jackson podcast presented by Past and Present Media. Today we are talking to historian and author Paul Ballard-Whyte. How are we doing, Paul?
Thank you, Jackson. Yes, I'm well, thank you. Absolutely fine on this sunny winter's morning. Yes, very nice. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you on the podcast. I've really enjoyed your book here, Lucky Hitler's Big Mistakes. Firstly, yes. Thank you to Pen and Sword for sending me a copy. So I wanted to ask you, Paul. This is a very interesting topic, and it's a perspective of looking at Hitler that not a lot of historians have looked at before.
Yes.
What was your inspiration for writing this book?
Well, I think really from about 15 years of teaching the subject. It's probably where it came from. I covered it in so much detail and I was teaching the students about it, that I found myself actually saying to them, he was very lucky here, he was very lucky there. It accumulated in my mind. I said it quite a lot on a lot of different occasions. And that's really how it came about. It just struck me that over a long period of time, Adolf Hitler, things that happened to him were sheer luck. We imagine that because he was became the leader, that he created everything, but in actual fact, most of the events that surrounded him had nothing to do with him, but they played into his career, so to speak, and his build-up of popularity. Things happened he had nothing to do with. So that's luck, and of course that's really the first part of the book. Half of the book is based on luck. We can talk a bit more about luck in a minute, right?
So when we're talking about luck and Hitler and him, a lot of things being out of his control, did Hitler himself actually believe in the concept of luck?
Well, that is actually a good question, because he, in a matter of translation from German in a way, because he didn't really use the word directly translated as luck. What he did was quite a lot was the word providence. Now, by any accounts, providence is chance. It is a form of luck. It's a bit more spiritual, and I think he possibly thought himself to be a messianic visitor to planet Earth, and so events that happened for him were meant to happen because it was him. So that's providence. But so, although he didn't say luck himself, he did use it. For example, he said here, for example, if providence, I think by that he meant luck. If providence had not guided me, I would never have founded these successful paths. And he also said later on, he said that I go the way providence dictates, with the assurance of a sleepwalker. So he obviously was fully aware things were happening to him that weren't exactly in his control.
It's really interesting, seeing those Hitler's use of the word providence and how he's come to recognize the role that providence is playing within his own life. Now, within your book, you chart Hitler's life and the role of luck or providence and mistakes in his life. And one crucial moment of that for Hitler was his joining up of the Nazi Party. So where did Hitler's relationship with the party begin?
Well, really, it began immediately after the end of the First War, because Germany was obviously defeated in 1918, and the whole country was in turmoil. The government was not settled. It wasn't powerful, and people were on the streets, forming one group after another, left wing, right wing, with all sorts of ideas. And actually, he had been in the First World War. We'll go back to talk about that in a minute. But when he came out, he was immediately recruited by an army officer responsible for looking into the sorts of problems that were going on in the streets. And he was just simply recruited as a spy. And his job was to go around the beer halls of Munich and identify troublemakers, you might say. And of course, he in one of the places he went to, the German Workers' Party, he was taken by what their ideas were. And he stood up and said his piece. And lo and behold, everybody shocked and paid attention, suddenly said, who's this guy who could talk so well? He joined that party after a short time. He became the leader of that party, and he changed the name to what we know as the Nazi Party. So that's how he became involved. Of course, it was natural. All the things that we're talking about were what he believed were his personal ideology.
It's really quite interesting to see that relationship grow from him just being there to observe and highlight people into him growing that party and centering around himself. Now, in 1923, we have a crucial moment for both Hitler and the party, and it was their ill-fated attempt to seize power with the Munich beer hall putsch. Would you be able to unpack what this movement was and the effect that it had on Hitler and the Nazi Party?
Yes, I mean, this was really, remember, after 4 or 5 years of growth of the party under his leadership, because he took over as leader fairly quickly. And as I say, there was plenty of competition. The main competition on the streets was the Communist Party and left-wing parties. And he had built up a large following. His group was now becoming one of the biggest, one of the most popular, best attended. More than that, they had recruited many ex-soldiers, and they had formed this paramilitary protection group, which we know as the Brown Shirts, the SA, in other words. And so it had already, after 4 or 5 years, become very large and very significant power, albeit a sort of street power at this stage. But the year before, Hitler heard about a chap in Italy called Mussolini. He couldn't believe it. He said, what? Mussolini just gathered his followers, marched on the government and took over? Yes, he did. So Hitler thought, well, if he could do it, I can do it. And basically that's what happened. So one day, he and his large group of 1,000 stormed into a public meeting. He stormed in, pulled out his gun, fired a shot into the ceiling. Everybody stopped, as you can imagine. And he declared that there was now a revolution. And someone there, a chap, his name was Professor Muller, actually. And he actually recorded the event. And I just think it's worth noting the way that what he said. He said, when Hitler spoke, it was a rhetorical masterpiece that totally transformed the audience. Now, when you think about the circumstances, Hitler must have had some amazing X factor in his ability, his oratory powers, because if you imagine yourself in that situation, you wouldn't be thinking of to be impressed by someone's speech skills, but he was. And so anyway, from there, it was decided that they would take on the Munich government, and several thousand of him and his followers, several thousand of them decided to march on the city hall. Now, this is where a very, very good example of luck. It couldn't be anything else, could it? Because he was in the front, in the middle. On one side, one of his colleagues, Richter, on the other side was Goring. When they were confronted by the local police force, armed police force, who opened fire. Richter, on his left-hand side, dropped dead. Goring, on his right-hand side, was shot in the leg. 15 other people were shot dead. But Hitler, I was like, okay, so that's pretty remarkable luck. But that was a continuation, if I can quickly refer back to it, to the First War. This is luck. This business of luck is always a question, well, what really is luck? And to be honest, because I was going to write this book, based on, half of it anyway, based on luck, I thought, do we have an interpretation of luck? And I did actually find one in Oxford Dictionary, of course. It says that luck is success that seems to happen by chance. It's the arbitrary distribution of events or outcomes. Sounds like a good definition, a very clear definition. And if we think about it for a moment, if I can, just refer back through history, it also struck me that luck had played such a large part in many big moments in history. I haven't got time to go into the full detail, but just a quick reminder, even in the great famous date of 1066, William the Conqueror, we think of him as the incredibly great soldier. Actually, he only conquered by luck, because King Harold, who had a big army waiting for him, had to march up north to fend off the Vikings. Half his army was killed off, and by the time he came back, William had already landed on the beach. And Harold wasn't really in a position to defend him. So that was luck. Even in the great Spanish Armada, we tend to think Francis Drake, yes, he was a great sailor, no doubt about it. But it wasn't. That's not how the Spanish Armada was defeated. It was defeated by bad weather. A storm brewed up. We're all sailing ships. They were scattered and lost. And that was pure luck. Okay, so you get my point. And it also, even in politics, recently, fairly recently, one Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, famously says that it really is only a matter of events, dear boy. That's what determines for a Prime Minister. And if you think of today, of recent events, yes, you could say luck played its part in recent Prime Ministers' careers, I think. So I just wanted to really throw open this idea that I'm quite prepared to discuss what luck really is, but I think these are the kind of examples that I'm referring to when I say that Hitler was extremely.
Yeah, I can certainly see it within some of these events that luck's playing a massive role in Hitler's successes and his ability to capitalize on them and capitalize on situations as well. And looking at the next big situation that hits Germany and particularly the world in 1929, Hitler is able to capitalize on the Wall Street crash. Massive financial implications not only for America but the rest of the world due to America's financial power in the post-World War One period. So, what effect does this Wall Street crash have on Germany, and how is Hitler able to capitalize on it?
Well, it did have. I actually make the argument that this was the cause of his rise to power, and therefore, you could say the cause of the war, because it was all happening in America, center of world finance, of course, and it became the financial crisis. We've seen them recently as well, and it was a collapse of economies. Now, this is only about 10, 11 years after the end of the First War. Germany, which had obviously suffered economically after the First War, had been in poverty, really. And that was one reason why Hitler's party was proving very popular during those years. And he had built up his support, yes, but the communists on the other side had built up their support too. The difference that this made was that Hitler was able to, the effect in Germany, first of all, was that people who were just beginning to recover from the effects of the end of the First War, just beginning to recover, suddenly it was this massive slump. And so people, again, were confronted in an instant, a weakened economy with unemployment which soared up to more than 3 million people. And so they looked around very quickly for answers. And I would have often debated with people about this. But do you know, I think it was only natural human reaction. If you are in extreme poverty, if things have completely collapsed around you, you will look around for a quick answer, for a clear answer, for a simple answer. This is what Hitler offered people. The first thing he did, and I think this is what we would look for again, to blame. Who's to blame? Well, for Hitler, that was simple. He was able to identify who was to blame. It wasn't the American government, the national economics. This was a great opportunity for him to point a finger at what he had already been saying was one of Germany's big problems. And that was the weak government that had surrendered at the end of the First War, that had created this German feeling of shame, of defeat. And who were these people who had done that? Well, they were Jews. The Jews were in the government, were part of the government, were all Bolsheviks as far as he was concerned. And he said it's quite simple. That's why Germany is in the mess it's in at the moment. And not only that, but the only people that have prospered since the end of the war are the Jews. So it was easy for him to target these two groups, the Jews and the Bolsheviks. And so for those reasons then, all of his arguments that he had been making were reinforced by this economic collapse. It was an ideal moment for him, but it was entirely nothing to do with him that it happened. So that was difficult.
And like you said there, and we previously touched on his oracy skills, to be able to clearly communicate to the people exactly what they want to hear, allows, as you just mentioned, for him to capitalize that. And as we've just been talking about, this starts the process of Hitler's rise to power, Germany's collapse into a dictatorship. And then there were two events which really kind of finalized this collapse, which is the Reichstag fire and the death of President Hindenburg. And this kind of allows Hitler to become a very powerful figure within Germany. And how does he set about using this newfound power in 1934?
Well, the first thing that happened, his popularity, as I just said, grew enormously as a result of the Wall Street crash. And from that, he then, he had been, by the way, in prison, but he had been in prison. And during that time in prison, he had written, or he had someone write for him. In fact, it was Hess, Rudolf Hess, wrote down his thoughts, and they were formed into an infamous book called Mein Kampf. That was really important because, in a sense, that was his manifesto, written for all to see. And a lot of people bought his book. In fact, he became very rich from the sales of that book. But it was quite clear in it which direction he was going in. But more importantly, perhaps, was that Hess had persuaded Hitler that storming town halls in Munich wasn't going to get him the power he wanted. The only way to power was through the ballot box, which of course is slightly ironic, but anyway, he adopted that, took that on, and decided after released from prison that was what he was going to do. And they were being represented at general elections. And so again, the effect of the Wall Street crash was a huge increase in popularity of the Nazi Party. So people actually were going into the ballot box and voting for the Nazi Party in large numbers. So large, in fact, that by 1933, they were the largest party in the Reichstag, the center of government. And so, as the leader of the largest party, it put him in a very strong position. Although many tried to resist letting him be Chancellor of all Germany, one of his attributes was he's a very stubborn arguer, and he never took no for an answer. He never listened to other people's point of view. Anyway, that was part of his, might say, part of his great qualities. It's one way of doing it. One way to defeat an argument is to ignore it. That's what he did. So anyway, the president, Hindenburg, was very cautious. He was 84. He was very cautious of this right-wing fascist Hitler, Adolf Hitler, taking over as chancellor. But he was kind of, more or less, had left a little choice. And Hitler in 1933, Hitler became chancellor of Germany. That was astonishing. The rise to success from a virtual down and out artist, as he was before the war, to this now chancellor of Germany. And of course, yes, then you were asking about what happened next. Well, incredible luck, this, because two things happened. Once he became chancellor in 1933, two events happened which were quite out of his control, but were amazing. And it really sealed his power. The first was that within a few weeks of him becoming chancellor, the Reichstag parliament was set on fire. It was a massive fire, by the way. We're really talking burning the place out. It really was a job. But somebody was caught very quickly on site. And lo and behold, he was a communist activist. Well, that was absolutely perfect as far as Hitler was concerned. And because he was he was held up in public. There we are, said Hitler. There's your enemy. Right at our door, burning down your own government. So politically, it was perfect. The poor chap, was a Dutch, so a poor young fella, was executed by guillotine. That rings back to the French Revolution, doesn't it? But that was an indication of the style of punishments that Nazis were likely to be dishing out. So anyway, so he was executed. Communists actually suffered very badly from it because the president was persuaded, again by Hitler, that the Communist Party should be banned. Now, terrific. The president obviously was in a corner. He could hardly argue with that. He banned communist parties. So that meant there were no communists in Reichstag. So the Nazis had total control of Reichstag. And this gave them the opportunity to pass what's called the Enabling Act. Now, the Enabling Act was quite simply giving Hitler total power. He could make law. Reichstag didn't even have to. That's what the Enabling Act did. So there, his power is moving up the way very quickly here. And to make it total, the next event, he had definitely nothing to do with him, was poor old president, Hindenburg, 84 years old. He died very conveniently, but there was no mischief about it. Died very conveniently. The Nazi Party, having full control, very quickly tidied the whole thing up and said Hitler should not only be chancellor, but should also be president. So there we are, a series of events, none of which were actually created by Hitler, all of which benefited to the point that he was now de facto dictator of Germany.
And they're two really key events that really show Hitler and the Nazi Party's skill at being able to capitalize off the events, but also make sure that they get a tangible benefit from them. such as you said, the banning of the Communist Party and the combination of the office of the Chancellery and the presidency to make that title of the Führer. Now, within your book, you come across a really interesting aspect of Hitler's personal and political life that isn't often touched upon in popular historical discourse, and that is Hitler's sex life.
Yes,
Um,
yeah,
Now,
yes.
I found this chapter particularly fascinating because I hadn't heard of much of this
No,
within
no.
my reading. So, how did Hitler, and you mentioned with alongside this chapter the political scandals that come along with sex life with popular uh, politicians such as Bill
Yeah,
Clinton.
yeah, yes, yeah.
How was Hitler able to escape any type of political scandal with his so-called unusual sex
Yeah,
life?
yeah, that's right, that's right. I think it is absolutely fascinating. And funny enough, you're right. It's hardly ever touched upon but there is a lot to it. And it is really, really important element because when we, again, just quick reflection on history, as you said, President Clinton, the US President Clinton is a very good example of someone being brought down because of a sex scandal. Now, of course, he certainly wasn't the only one. You can go back as far as looking back in history, as far back as Caligula, who was murdered actually because of his sexual perversions, and people like in our recent history, and you might remember uh, what was called the Profumo affair, when our defence, the British Defence Secretary, was having an affair with a prostitute, Christine Keeler, who was also having an affair with a Russian diplomat. Now, that brought down the whole government. The whole Conservative government was brought down to that. And slightly more recently, the Liberal leader, there was a Liberal leader called Jeremy Thorpe, who looked like he was going to survive the Liberal Party's fortunes. He thought so anyway. But he was seen to be involved in some attempted murder of a homosexual lover. Now, all of these things are just examples, but if sexual scandal is touched on with a leader, it seems to me it's the end. There's no going back. The public have got no sympathy. Maybe like to read about it. They don't. Yeah, that's right. But they don't have any sympathy for them. Now, Hitler, then, you might think this rather funny looking man, you wouldn't imagine, somewhere or another, he looked almost asexual. And some people thought he was. A lot of people also thought he was homosexual. Now, there were a few reports. One American journalist wrote very clearly, he said that Hitler was very ladylike, dainty little steps. Okay, take that as you like. But others did often say that his mannerisms were quite effeminate and so on. And of course, he wasn't seen with women. He's always seen on his own. It was never the same woman or any woman very often near him. But Hitler was very conscious, actually, nevertheless. He was conscious of this feminine sort of image. And you can see even in the time here, he looks very macho there. He made sure that when he was photographed, nearly always he's wearing uniform leather belts, long leather boots, and nearly always he carried a whip, a bullwhip, which he would crack against his leather boots when he was talking to make him sound more macho. When he met the females, he introduced himself as Herr Wolf. So he was clearly very, 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 very aware of this. But, and this was the thing, he certainly wasn't sexual. In actual fact, he was a sexual predator. And he favored teenage, juvenile teenagers, girls. And as it turned out, his behaviour when he did have these relationships, there are quite a few mentioned in the book. He had quite a few with teenage girls. He very quickly turned them into, fall today to be sort of sadomasochist relationship. And I think that is the big shock factor that you're alluding to there. I don't think that's generally considered that he was indeed, without any doubt. And we have quite a lot of evidence to that. For example, he had a long relationship with his niece, well, his niece, who he had met in, well, he knew her, obviously, his half-niece, his half-sister's daughter. But she had come in to visit him in prison, aged about 14, 15. He was taken very much with her. And quite sometime afterwards, he decided that his sister could come and work for him. He had a house now in Bjarke's garden, that his sister could come and work for him as housekeeper. But his ulterior motive was that she would bring along her daughter, who was now 17. And sure enough, it didn't take long. Hitler had her living next door to him in his flat, and they became lovers. But she wrote to her friend, and this is one of the evidence of her. She said, this is her words, chilling words. She says, "You'd never believe the things that he makes me do." Okay, so we can leave it at that as far as his relationship with her name was Gelly. But he went on, and he had, just in the book, I list 5 different females that he had very questionable relationships. One of them was even a Jewish princess. Now, if you can imagine, if any of these, time to go through them all, but if any of these scandals had become public, it would have completely ruined this image that Hitler had built up of a messiah, of a savior, of a superhuman, a man who is a man for himself. And so would have brought him down. I think you asked how he managed to avoid that. Well, that question can probably be summed up in one word: Gestapo. And so anybody that knew about Hitler's behavior was simply kept out of it. The media, if they knew, wouldn't dare say anything. That's how it's the difference between Hitler's sexual scandals and everybody else's sexual scandals was that it was a totalitarian fascist state where nobody had any free speech.
And that's a huge part of a lot of totalitarian regimes, as you just mentioned, that they're able to hide information, and if they're able to hide the leaders' certain scandals, then that will only seek to strengthen that leader's position, that party's position. And now, taking that idea of making Germany stronger and the leader stronger, throughout the 1930s, Hitler was able to negotiate Germany into a position of international strength. And this can be through a variety of different factors and actors. But how was he able to achieve this? Was it through his own skill, or was it through the weakness of different bodies, say Neville Chamberlain or the League of Nations?
Well, it was a combination, of course. But it was primarily, he had, even though he was very lucky with his national events that happened around him, he did have skills of his own. Of course, his greatest skill was, as I've said earlier, was his powers of oratory. Anytime he made a speech, seemed to win over his audience. But he had lots of other skills, you might say. He was certainly very self-opinionated, self-confident, arrogant. He was passionate towards other people. So he had many traits rather than qualities. And yes, he used them. He used them as soon as he had the power of a dictator. By this time, remember, it's a long time that he's had this run of luck. And by this time, he believed, he could see that he was lucky. And he then became what you might call an addicted gambler almost, who believes that they're going to win everything. And that was what, and that did, that confidence, extreme confidence, it carried him a long, long way. Somehow or another, he understood that if he demanded something, said he was going to do something and did it, he seemed to be able to stop him, which is, a skill in its own. For example, immediately, as Chancellor, he had obviously been talking a lot about what he was going to be doing. Now he was Chancellor and dictator. He set about immediately carrying them out. And we have to remember is that Germany was under this huge pressure from the Treaty of Versailles, which at the end of the war imposed huge financial reparations on the German nation. So Germany, already poor, was having to pay out vast sums of money to the victors of the First War. Which might sound fair, since they caused a lot of damage, but the thing was, it meant that Germany was being kept poor, as they were giving away so much of their whatever income they made. The other thing that was restricted was by the Treaty of Versailles, with the size of the armed forces. Germany was not allowed to have oversized armed forces. But I think the third thing was probably the most important, and that was the Treaty of Versailles made Germany accept or confess or agree that they had started the war. Well, they did, but what that did was it then put all the blame onto Germany and therefore onto the German people. And of course, at the end of it, they had to surrender. They had to admit defeat. What this created in Germany was a wide feeling of shame. And Hitler tapped into that perfectly. That's really politically what had made him so popular, because of those policies. And he had promised that he would solve all of those things. And so the first thing that more or less the first thing that he did, that after the war, the Americans had formed what was known as the League of Nations, which is really kind of a forerunner to the United Nations today. And everybody was, all countries were members. All countries were members and promised peaceful futures. But Hitler stepped in and he announced at a meeting of the League of Nations, in front of all of these nations, totally boldly, without any hesitation, he announced that one, Germany was going to leave the League of Nations. Why? We're away. And the other thing is, you're not going to get any more money from us. You're not going to get any more reparations. Well, you can imagine how popular that was in Germany. Very popular. And they saw this. This is the strong leader we've been waiting for. So that's how that was interpreted. That added to his prestige, added to his sense of power, and also added to his own self-belief. So that wasn't strong enough. So he used that from then on, over the next few years, to rebuild the armed forces. To his economy, he set out what was called a 4-year plan. But what it was spend money rebuilding forces, building weapons, and suddenly unemployment dropped. People had money in their pocket. Armed forces were being built up. Weapons were being built. Even the Air Force was being rebuilt. Now, all of this was against the rules, against the Treaty of Versailles. So what on earth were all the other countries doing, letting him please himself? Well, he just couldn't believe it. Well, he did believe it. He was astonished that he was getting to do anything that he wanted. Even mass murder, or even murder. You may have heard of the Night of the Long Knives. Well, this was just a year into his power, and I had already mentioned them earlier to you, the SA, the brown shirts. By this time, they were a massive paramilitary army, really. And the leader of it was Ernst Röhm, who had done a terrific job for Hitler, for the SA, in creating this large military power. Trouble was, Hitler now was looking over his shoulder, and whispers from his secret police were that Röhm was maybe getting a bit too big for his boots. He maybe was going to be a threat to Hitler, because Hitler really wanted now to take control of the SA himself. So what did he do? He arranged with a few of his SS guards to visit Röhm, who was having day away in a hotel by the lake. By the way, Röhm was a homosexual, and did have some friends with him. Anyway, Hitler, with a gun in his hand, and his SS bodyguards entered the hotel and promptly shot several of the Röhm's fellows and threw Röhm in prison, and handed him a gun and gave him the option to shoot himself. Incidentally, Röhm didn't shoot himself, and an officer went in and shot instead. But and actually out of that, hundreds of other people were shot, because there was a list. I think this is indicative of the style of rule of the Nazis. And before Hitler went to go over the SA, he made a list of people who he saw as being potential trouble or just a nuisance. And it turned out it was 400 people were killed, murdered during that day, which is now known as the Night of the Long Knives. Perhaps the most astonishing outcome of it was he declared what he had done to Parliament, to the people, and he said that he was clearing out the rot, that he had defeated an attempted coup, and instead of making him incriminating himself as a murderer, it's made him more popular. He was seen as even more powerful, even more important. A man who could get things done, a man who could get Germany on the right road.
You've definitely really shown how Hitler was able to build that power abroad and internationally by standing up to the Treaty of Versailles, which people hated so much, and standing up to the League of Nations, but also consolidating that control at home, which is so important for dictators as well. Now, a lot of this for Hitler would have been impossible, almost impossible, without his, as you call them in your book, his inner circle, his henchmen. So how did Hitler get lucky? And we've mentioned a few of them already, but how did he get lucky with his henchmen?
Well, he was very lucky with his henchmen. I know that sounds a sick thing to say in a way, because his henchmen were just as bad, and some of them worse even, if that's possible, than Hitler himself. But this was the thing. Hitler didn't put an advert in the paper for henchmen. Come and see me. People turned up. People appeared. The right people emerged very quickly in front of him with the right skills for the right jobs that they ended up doing. And it's astonishing. But and you wonder where they came from. But an example, for example, when he was in court before he went to jail, and this was another example, actually, also of his ability to win over the most unlikely audience. He pleaded guilty to March, and he should have been found guilty of treason, locked up forever, possibly even executed. But instead, he announced himself to be doing it for the best of reasons, and made a long speech as to why it was. And the judge actually said, hey, he's quite a decent chap, this Hitler. Can you imagine the judge saying that? But all of his speeches were reported, and they were recorded in national newspapers. And this all, of course, added to, while he was in jail at this time, it's added to his fame. And one person far away in Berlin was reading the report and was very impressed with what he read. His name was Joseph Goebbels. So Joseph Goebbels, impressed by the speeches, determined himself that he would go and offer his services to Hitler. And as it turned out, Goebbels was an incredibly talented person. He really was very talented at what we say today, media stuff, propaganda, but also electioneering ideas. All came from it. Really, another argument is that Hitler wouldn't have been successful without Goebbels at his side, because like every politician, you have to have an image. You've got to look right. You've got to sound right. You've got to be in the right place at the right time. And Goebbels actually, you might say he was okay because of technology, flights and airplanes. He was the first to utilize this idea of flying around the country and dropping in. So it was like someone from heaven dropped down into your patch of land, outstepped the Messiah, gave a wonderful speech, and then everybody voted for him. And then you would fly up again to the next place. This was entirely Goebbels' creation. He called it Hitler over Germany. Very creative. So that's just one example of Goebbels. I mean, another person that we know quite well usually is Hermann Goering. Again, Hermann Goering, who had been a World War I flying ace, was a bit of a sort of aristocrat. His father was, and so he mixed with that sort of level of society, and he threw himself into service for Hitler. Now, Hitler should have been rejected. Should have rejected. Goebbels was everything Hitler was against. He liked. He was rich. He liked the good life. He was interested in all sorts of things. He liked cigars, good wine, good food. The good life, in other words. Hitler, of course, was just, I don't know if you know, but Hitler was actually teetotal. And he didn't smoke. In fact, he more or less banned smoke. He didn't like smoke at all.
Some as we mentioned, he got very lucky with bringing Goebbels and Goering into his inner circle and keeping them close to him to help him get through several issues. Some of these henchmen, such as Albert Speer, were involved in plots against Hitler and plots on Hitler's life. So how was Hitler able to survive some of these attempts on his life?
Right, Jackson. If I can, I just want to sort of change that a little bit, because his henchmen didn't try to take his life. It was in their interest for him to be successful, because the more successful he was, the more successful they were. So they didn't want rid of him. It is true to say that right at the very end of the war, Albert Speer claimed that he considered trying to get rid of Hitler, but that was really in the very, very last few years of the war. When you're talking about assassination attempts, what maybe I think was his generals. It was quite a lot of his generals wanted rid of him because they knew that they were fighting a losing battle with him at the head. So there were many occasions. In fact, perhaps the luckiest Hitler was the amount of times that he dodged the assassins.
Now, your first half of your book, which is incredibly interesting, we've just spoken about now, all about luck. I'd like to ask you what your favorite examples of luck that Hitler encountered.
Well, if you could describe them as favorite from the point of view as some of the most remarkable, certainly. Well, I'd have to go back to the First War. One case, certainly his time in the First War. He was 4 years on the front line. 4 years on the front line. His job was a Radfahrer, which really was just a messenger. Sometimes on a bike, sometimes on foot. But he was running from place to place on the front, between trenches, with messages between one officer and another commanding officer. So you can imagine, goes without saying, that it's an incredibly dangerous place to be. And it was several examples, but one day, for example, he had just come out of headquarters, where incidentally, the officer who had just sent a recommendation for Hitler to be given the Iron Cross, and actually Hitler was given the Iron Cross twice, as well as other medals. So it's one thing that we can be pretty sure with Hitler. So he certainly wasn't a coward, and he treated warfare, disdain really, which is quite remarkable. Having, as I said, spent 4 years there, but he just had come out of the headquarters when headquarters was hit by either a bomb or an artillery shell, blew up. Everybody in it was killed, and he had just left the place. But that was just one of the examples. I mean, the other thing, for example, the regiment, he's a member of the 16th Bavarian Regiment. He was involved in every main battle in the First War. We're talking about Ypres, Passchendaele, and infamous Somme. He was there at every battle. At Ypres, the Battle of Ypres, I think it was 1,600 or more, 3,000, sorry. I think it was 3,000 in his particular regiment. In the beginning of the battle, it was 600 at the end. He was one of them. Well, that's pretty slim odds. Quite amazing. And as I say, even coming through the Somme, where I think 40,000 people, allies, I should say, were killed on the first day. I mean, he came through all of that. And perhaps that I love the story about Henry Tandy, a British soldier. He was a sniper, was just looking out, scanning the trenches. And this chap emerged from the trenches. He seemed to be injured. And lo and behold, turns out, this is a verified story, it was Hitler. But Tandy, he thought, you know what? He said, I can't actually shoot a wounded soldier. So he just let him go. And Hitler looked over, he saw the sniper, he looked at him, and he actually waved and acknowledged the fact that he hadn't shot him, because Hitler knew he. And Hitler verified the story, actually, because when Chamberlain went to meet him at his Berghof down by Salzburg, in the main room above the fireplace was this huge painting of a German soldier coming out of the trenches and a British sniper pointing a rifle. And Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain, asked Hitler, well, why have you got a picture of a British soldier? And Hitler said, that man saved my life. And he said, would you go and tell him thank you? Astonishing, yeah. And Chamberlain said that he would, and he did. and the man's name was Henry Tandy. I mean, it's astonishing. Hitler could have been taken out so many times during the First War. So I think from luck, I don't think you can get much luckier than Hitler in the First War. Other than that, of course, there were at least 40 assassination attempts. Of those, there were many famous ones. I could sit here all day telling you about them, but I know I can't. But do watch the movie Valkyrie. It is a recreation of the 20th July 1944 assassination attempt. And I can assure you, it's about as accurate a film as you get. You'll see just how lucky.
Those stories during the First World War really demonstrate just how lucky Hitler was, and you can understand how he believed that he was going down this path that Providence had set for him. So you can really see that, and those stories from the World War One really demonstrate that. Now, the first half of your book, as we just mentioned, was all about luck, and the second half of your book and the second half of your title as well is all about Hitler's mistakes.
Yes.
And when do you think this luck, this providence, begins to run out for Hitler?
Well, it's very clear, actually. It is actually, it's not difficult to absolutely pinpoint when the changes really happened. It was in 1941. At that point, Hitler ruled all of Europe except for Britain, and very nearly. Remember, the British Army had been expelled at Dunkirk. So Hitler was at his greatest peak of military success. This was when he was the greatest commander of all time. And it's little wonder that he thought that this was the moment to invade Russia. Now, he was betraying Russia because he already had made a deal with Stalin and the Russian government to conquer and share Poland. But that didn't stop him. No, not at all. As far as he was concerned, and he'd said this many years before in Mein Kampf, he made it quite clear. His main aim, actually, was going to be to conquer Russia, because he wanted to give the German people Lebensraum. I mean, obviously today, Ukraine is a very well-known country, and it's a very rich, arable country. Hitler saw all of that as being justifiably part of Germany. So he always had a plan to invade Russia. But he just wasn't sure when it was going to happen exactly. But now he was at the peak of conquering the whole of Europe. He felt this was the time. And on paper, he could say, and theoretically anyway, yeah, if he was going to do it, this was a good time to do it. Hitler had over 3 million soldiers lined up into 3 army groups. He had thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and he had 1 million horses. We never think of that, do we? We just think it's all tanks. I mean, it was a colossal. I'm just trying to give you if you could have seen it from space, you would have seen it, the army. It was quite astonishing. So anyway, I'm getting to the point here that you asked about mistakes, because you can see the euphoria, the belief was at this point in time. He was the lucky gambler who never lost, and he called it Operation Barbarossa. And they made great progress. They did sweep across the Russian plains, across Ukraine, across it. One army group went north, Petersburg, central group headed for Moscow, and the third group went south towards Caucasus and the oil fields. This was a very sensible plan. You know, absolutely, you couldn't really fault the strategy at this point in time. However, it was a bit late. It was June, but it was a bit late from the Russian point of view, because by the time we got to Moscow, it was winter. Winter comes quickly, as Napoleon found out 100 years before. And Hitler was aware of Napoleon. You all about it. But anyway, When he got to, by the time he got to Moscow, before he got to Moscow, he interfered. He interfered. He split his armies. He took away part of the Central Army. He decided Moscow wasn't going to be a priority. Yeah, so this is his first mistake. Because he sacked his head of the army, Whitefish, and he said, the only person good enough, the only person that knows what needs done is myself. He said, anybody commander of an army, and I am going to be the commander of the army. Well, you can't get much more arrogant than that, but of course he had title whispering in his ear that he was the greatest commander of the time, so perfectly reasonable. He might believe that. So he takes over as the actual field commander. Now, there's a big difference from him being the dictator, certain broad plans, to becoming the actual general overall in charge, commander in chief, which he was. He was actually started taking tactical decisions. That's when it all started going wrong. Because you see, Hitler's experience of war was certainly front line trenches. Absolutely nothing about we described as officer training, about battle strategy. So he never understood any of that. And that's what came to haunt him. Because later on in the book, there's a whole episode, a whole chapter called Verstungen. And, you know, this is, I don't see this word used a lot in history books, but I'm happy to say that this was the one of the great big mistakes Hitler made. But it wasn't one mistake. Verstungen is the word, actually, just a very, very briefly. It's a German word for castle or a defended location. And Hitler's, again, this is where his ideology betrayed him every time. He knew nothing about military tactics, but he believed in his ideology. And ideologically, in history, German people had defended themselves by building a castle and defending the castle and until the enemy went away. Yeah, of course you can do that when the enemy have got bows and arrows, not when the enemy have got guns as big as the Russians have. So this was part of his thoughts of military tactics. They weren't military tactics at all. They were just ideological misconceptions. And so when he got to Moscow, he split his army, he took over control, and from that moment on, some people think it's Stalingrad, but actually it's before Stalingrad. From that moment on, when he didn't take Moscow, he makes one military mistake after another. And every one of them, and he cannot get away with it. Up until then, the decisions were, tactical decisions were made by his generals and field marshals. So Hitler, in the end, Hitler would claim credit for it. It was his generals that were doing it. What he couldn't do now was, because he was commander-in-chief, the German word for it was Feldherr. Okay? Feldherr just means the overall commander. Now he was Feldherr. He could claim all victories, if there were any. But what he couldn't do was he couldn't deny fault. And he now became the decision maker of all the mistakes that Germany made from that moment on. And there's a lot of them.
It's interesting to see where history repeats itself, as you mentioned with Napoleon, where Hitler's mistake and where his luck begins to run out is very similar to where Napoleon his luck starts to run out and his mistakes start to come to the fray. And it's very interesting that you bring in ideology with Verstungen. Hitler's ideology was the backbone of his regime. But in your work, you present Hitler's ideological rigor as a mistake. Could you break this down for us?
Yes, well, you see, ideology it's completely dominated his point of view on absolutely everything. In many ways, his speeches were probably so convincing because they were from his heart, really. He founded this ideology of superiority. German race, Aryan race, it's called, was a superior race. It was different from everybody else. And that all other groupings in society that weren't white and weren't German were Untermensch, it's a German word, which really just means underclasses, underclass. And he applied this simply. I mean, it's a simple idea. You just point to anybody else you don't like and say that they're inferior, and better than that is you are superior. And because this added to the arrogance of the German forces in many ways, you know. So his ideology was carried through. A good example of his ignorant, and I mean ignorant, part of his ideology was at the same time as he took over as commander-in-chief. And this was the other moment that sealed, if you like, his fate and his list of mistakes, was that at almost the same time, Japanese Empire, as they called themselves, were mad enough to attack the United States of America at Pearl Harbor. We all have heard of Pearl Harbor, 7th of December. Now, when Hitler got news of it, which was more or less the same night, he was delighted. He was absolutely ecstatic. Couldn't believe it. That's exactly because one of the fears he had, was conscious of, was that America might actually join in the war. Okay, he knew they were sending stuff, equipment, but he was fearful that Americans would actually join in. So what does he do? He declares war on America. I mean, you could not make that up. He really did declare war on the United States. And well, why? Well, you see, this is what his ideology was. Because he had a concept in his mind of America. Oh, these were all, first of all, Americans were either Jews or they were black Africans. You know, from a black Africans race. As far as he was concerned, that was it. There was, and they were very communist. A lot of it seems ridiculous for a capitalist country. But this is what ideology does and did to him. It completely blindsided him. He believed in this simplistic descriptions. I mean, he said, just a little quote here, for example. He actually said this. He said he was explaining to his adjutant, I think it was his adjutant, as to why America was not going to be a problem. Because he said, the United States of America is a green country. It's a mongrel nation. It's got strong ties to the Jews, and it's rotten with Jews and blacks. That sums up exactly what Hitler thought of America. Now, the fact that America could produce more replacement planes in one day, Germany could in months, never crossed his mind. Never crossed his mind. So that's a kind of fatal mistake. His ideology.
And it's interesting how his ideology not only prevented the development of his regime and his military policy, but also allowed him to, or facilitated his underestimation of the US and their power and their role in the world and militarily as well. Now, there's one area of the German military which Hitler didn't seem to value as much during World War II, and that is the German Navy. Why does Hitler's undervaluing of the German Navy represent a failure of his?
Well, you're right. Short answer to that is he was a World War I soldier in the trenches. Ships meant nothing to him. He had no affinity for the sea or for ships or for the navy, for that matter. So when he took world power as the Führer, and he had this plan to expand military forces, he thought, in World War I mentality, he thought that the British Navy appeared to be huge and unbeatable, and it certainly had absolutely had been. And he thought that because they had built in the First War large ships, huge battleships, and there was really only one big battle, Jutland, of course. But he thought that all the Navy needed was the most modern, best technology, biggest possible battleships, and that's fine. So the allocation of funds to the Navy was aimed only at building capital ships. He had no interest in it whatsoever in terms of its military use. I mean, after all, Germany, yes, it does have access to the sea, but it's unlike Britain, of course, which of course is an island. That's why our history, British history, is made and determined because we were an island, because we had a navy. That's where the empire came. Anyway, that's another matter. But so that's where his funds went to, and it never really, trust me. Every time his head of navy at the time got him to come along and look at the latest ship, Hitler was impressed. This is bigger than the last one. It had more guns in it than the last one. As far as he was concerned, that was going to teach the British Navy when time came. However, it was a huge mistake. 1935, and this I'll never understand, Britain agreed to let Germany rebuild its navy. Worse than that is it allowed it to build the navy up to a certain size, and that included, it said, half the number of U-boats that Britain had. Britain never had that many U-boats anyway, submarines anyway. But however, but here was a great opportunity to jump ahead a little bit. I think you were going to ask me about my favorite mistake. This is it. This is the one of two. And this would happen before. Hitler could have, I believe, absolutely, could have won the war before it started. And he could have won the war before it started if he had spent most of the money, instead of building big ships that were always going to be useless. By the way, you've probably heard of some of them. Bismarck, Scharnhorst, there were others. Graf Spee. These were fantastic. State of the art. Beautiful, big ships. Where did they go during the war? Well, they hid in a fjord somewhere in Norway. They couldn't come out to sea because he was afraid if they came out, they would get sunk. So instead of that, they just stayed in port, and they were still sunk because the RAF found where they were, and all of these great ships were actually sunk in the end. Anyway, but to get back to the point, what he should have been building were U-boats. And with all that steel and all that money that he used, he could have built hundreds. Instead, when the war started, he had about 30 GO U-boats. Do you know how big the Atlantic Ocean is?
Quite big.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you imagine 30 U-boats in the Atlantic. You know, it's a fly on a very, very large wall. If he had had several hundred U-boats, before he declared war, he could have totally blockaded Britain. Now, if he had even looked at the history of his own country, and if he had taken ideology or his racist bias out of the question, he would have realized Germany actually surrendered, not because they were defeated in the trenches, but because they were blockaded by the British Navy. They were blockaded. And the people that suffer there are the civilians and the government. They were the ones that surrendered. That was why they surrendered. And that's maybe slightly simplistic, but it was the overriding factor. Now, if he had noticed that properly, he could have done the same to Britain. And I have no doubt whatsoever. And indeed, Churchill himself said in his own history, said that the only, that's a big word, the only thing that ever frightened me in the Second War were the U-boats. If you think about it, Churchill can say that. Then I think it's a strong backing for my the U-boats could have won the war for Hitler. So you can't get a bigger mistake than that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and even like you said, for Churchill to be afraid of that, and for Hitler to not recognize Germany's own failings from World War One, I can really support that as that being your favorite mistake that Hitler made. It's certainly one of mine that you wrote down in your book, which I thought was a fascinating read. Now, a final fun question, as we do for all our guests here on the History of Jackson podcast. Well, you've worked and competed in many fields, and you've certainly developed many skills in those fields. What skills have you developed that you've been able to transfer across to your career as a historian?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's quite a question because, I mean, most of my life, certainly 30 years of it, before I was teaching, I was in business and, a variety of businesses, all of which I actually, started up from scratch and developed. And that takes a lot of determination. It really does. I mean, it obviously takes vision. You have to see your objective very clearly. So I'm sharing some factors with Hitler here, but hopefully not many. But certainly the experience in business is that there are ups and downs. You have to be able to deal with them. You have to be resilient. You have to be determined. And I think it's actually, it might be amusing. It's true to say, you need all of those things to be a teacher as well. So, turning to becoming a history teacher in later life, I think all of that experience was very valuable.
Yeah, having been in a classroom myself, those skills are definitely skills you 100% need in a history classroom. So, now, if our Hitlers, I'll rephrase that question. If our listeners want to go away and learn more about Hitler, Nazi Germany, what can they go away and read and listen to?
Right, well, it's an open question, and I've just got to answer. Well, the very first book you have to read is Lucky Hitler's Big Mistakes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's all right.
It's an open goal, that one. Because it does actually, if I can just say very, very briefly here, the book actually covers the whole war. Well, it covers pre-war and the whole war right to the very end of Hitler. So, in a sense, it's a history of the Second World War. It's just written in a different emphasis. But for perhaps a deeper look at the war, I would obviously recommend Andrew Roberts' range of. He's got several books which are well worth looking at. One of them is called The Storm of War, which is really a history of the Second War. Masters and Commanders, which go into much more detail about the leaders of the war. And really his definitive book, for which he's been lots of awards, is Churchill Walking with Destiny. So, you could stick to that, but that's in the back of my book, I've listed 15 further recommendations, which is a long list. I'm not going to read. They're in the book of the type of history books that I would personally recommend. I find them all informative, very readable, and well worth reading an hour before you go to bed.
Yeah. And
But one last, sorry, I must add that we shouldn't underestimate. Some people be a wee bit sniffy about this, but do not underestimate the value of YouTube. Sorry to have to advertise.
yeah.
The amount of World War II material available on YouTube is absolutely staggering, and yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff can be found. Documentaries, other resources are all, and it's free. So yeah, it's a good way to build up your knowledge and to touch into different areas to see what you'd like to read a bit more.
Yeah, and free is always amazing, isn't it? So
It's always amazing. Yeah, astonishing.
and of course, our readers are going to want to go away and grab a copy of your book. Where can they grab your book?
Well, they can come onto my website if they care to. It's very, very easy to remember. It's called www.luckyhitler.com. Or go into any social media and just type in #LuckyHitler, and that should take them to a variety of places. Of course, it's available in all the bookshops. If they don't have it, if they don't have it in stock, they can easily order it. But many are now stocking it, I'm glad to say. And where else can you find it? I think that's all the places, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I'll make sure there's a copy, a link that heads. I'll make sure that there's a link that takes you to buy a copy of the book in the description below, and a link to your website. And if our readers, our listeners, and potential readers want to go away and actually have a conversation with you, where can they find you?
Well, again, it's quite straightforward. If they want to email me on anything, just paul@luckyhitler.com.
Oh, fantastic. Now, I'll make sure all of those are in the description below. Thank you very much for coming on, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jackson. I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you very much.